Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping are currently holding their first substantive bilateral meeting after the Doklam standoff. Now, that meeting between the Prime Minister and the Chinese President began just a while back. These talks are taking place amid efforts by India and China to leave behind the bitterness that was caused by the 73-day Doklam standoff. According to sources, Modi and Xi are expected to discuss ways to create confidence-building measures. There are many outstanding issues, though, including border demarcation, trade deficit, tariffs on Chinese products that the two countries may discuss in this meeting. Now, the Xiamen declaration, which explicitly named Pakistan-based terror groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed and implored joint BRICS action against terror, was a big win for Indian diplomats and particularly for the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This will in fact put pressure on China to act against Masood Azhar, who, remember, China continues to oppose in terms of India's bid in the UN Security Council to list action against the Jaish chief. Now, some of the key issues on Prime Minister Modi's agenda are India-China relations post that standoff at Doklam, the fight against Pak-sponsored terrorism, China's increasing support to Pakistan, and an enhancement of bilateral relations with other BRICS nations. Prime Minister Modi also conducted bilateral talks with the President of Egypt on day 3 of the BRICS Summit. The Prime Minister arrived at Xiamen for the group photo op of BRIC leaders. He later attended BRICS meetings emerging markets dialogue. Speaking at that dialogue session, the Prime Minister said that it was the duty of BRICS nations to make a sovereign world. He also stressed on the need to create an inclusive, digital, skilled and healthy world. He said that India will contribute immensely to creating a connected world.
Excellency, 2 years since the adoption of UN's 2030 agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the imperative of collective action to achieve the goal is even stronger. Recently, in July, India completed the first voluntary national review of SDGs. The bedrock of our development agenda lies in the notion of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, that is, collective efforts, inclusive growth. We have mapped each of the SDGs to our own development programs and schemes, both at the federal level and state level. Our Parliament too has taken the initiative to organize parliamentary debates on SDGs. Our programs are geared up.
Speaking at the Emerging Markets Dialogue earlier, Chinese Premier Xi Jinping stressed upon the need to promote international cooperation and build a community of commonality. He further said that sustainable development was China's priority.
We need to call on the international community to place development high on the agenda of macro policy coordination, better leverage the role of the United Nations, make good use of the high-level political forum on sustainable development, and accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We need to urge developed countries to honor their commitments, to observe such principles as common but differentiated responsibilities, and to increase support to developing countries.
Apart from Xi, Prime Minister Modi will also be holding bilateral meetings, or in fact he's already had that meeting with the leader of Egypt. He's also had interactions with leaders of Mexico, Guinea and Thailand. And joining us live on the broadcast from Xiamen is my colleague, WION's correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran. Ramesh, hello once again. And that meeting, I believe, is underway between Premier Xi and Prime Minister Modi. If I can ask you, though, so much has been talked about when it comes to the Doklam standoff. What did the Doklam standoff and its resolution mean for China? We already know what it meant for India, but for China specifically, what did that resolution and the way it came about mean for its stature in Asia?
Well, to begin with, Aisha, China clearly probably did not anticipate India's move, India's preemptive move to, and this intervening in a third country is a significant departure for India's extant foreign policy and security policy. And to that extent, it is unprecedented, number one. Number two, at some level, China expected India to behave the way it did over decades now. But we're seeing a remarkable change in India's security posture. Remember, we saw the surgical strike, or the so-called surgical strike, happen on the border with Myanmar in 2015, followed by the surgical strikes at the line of control separating India from POK in 2016, and now India's intervention in the Doklam standoff, to my mind, clearly indicates a new dynamic in India's, or new element in India's foreign and security policy, and that is that probably would have confounded Chinese observers who've been observing India for a long time now. But at the same time, a third point, Aisha, if, as some say, one of the attempts by entering or by trying to change the status quo on Doklam would have been on the Chinese side to bring fissures into the India-Bhutan relationship, I guess after the Xiamen declaration, where Pakistan-based terrorist groups were specifically mentioned, it might also work against China's interests or relationship with Pakistan. So clearly, it is even Stevens, as some would call it at the moment, very delicately poised relationship. And this meeting, which is happening now as we speak, between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, should be one to watch out for, because that will set the pace, the tone, the tenor of future interactions with India and China, especially in the light of so many contentious issues bedeviling the relationship, including but not limited to the almost 4,000-kilometer long line of actual control, the undefined LAC that separates India from Tibet and China. Also the other issues of the India's quest for membership of the Nuclear Supplies Group and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which questions India's sovereignty at multiple levels.
Right. And Ramesh, many have called the standoff at Doklam and its resolution sort of a watershed moment in India and China's history. Do you think then that it is going to have at least an impact of some nature on conversations over border demarcation? Perhaps not today in that meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, but at least in the future.
Absolutely, and that's the expectation among some officials traveling along with Prime Minister Modi here in Xiamen. One expectation is obviously that a new mechanism should be devised between India and China, as would enable both sides to come to some sort of an understanding on the way forward in resolving issues such as Doklam, and not allow those issues to snowball into a big crisis. Remember, at the June summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization held at Astana in Kazakhstan, both India and China had agreed, the consensus emerging among both countries, that differences should not be allowed to become disputes. And the challenge before both countries today as we speak is, will that spirit survive even after the BRICS Summit? Why am I saying that? Because a lot of observers and commentators in India, in the official circles and also in the media, are talking about it these days, that the Doklam standoff may have been resolved for now, but China may well continue to probe India all along at multiple locations along the line of actual control. It could be also in a third country. The theater could change to a third country like it did in Doklam standoff, where Bhutan was the principal or the first aggrieved party, as it were. And so China might continue to probe India's resilience, especially in the wake of India standing up to the bullying tactics of China at Doklam. So things are in a state of flux. We have still not come to a modus vivendi or understanding on where this relationship will go from here. But the expectation is that when towards the end of the meeting here in Xiamen between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, there will be some sort of an understanding on what the two countries can do together, not only to become stakeholders in each other's economic growth, but also resolve the political differences so that for the benefit of their respective peoples and governments.
Right. Stay with me, Ramesh. I have a couple of follow-up questions for you on that. But before I go there, I just want to remind our viewers that we are bringing you some of the key shots of the day. That is Prime Minister Narendra Modi shaking hands with President Xi Jinping of China. Remember that all-important meeting underway right now between the two gentlemen who've been really speaking at the center of it all when it comes to BRICS, at least for audiences in India and China specifically. Now, that bilateral underway between the two. In fact, the Ministry of External Affairs is expected to hold a press briefing very shortly in which we'll be able to understand more clearly what exactly the conversation was all about, the contours and, of course, broad strokes and the sharper details of the conversation that is underway between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Among the things that are considered possibilities in terms of what might come up for conversation, there is, of course, the Doklam standoff. It was a 73-day impasse between the two Asian giants, and it was resolved, many would say amicably, but diplomatically for certain. It was considered a watershed moment in terms of India's foreign policy, the way it has chosen to engage with China over the years, and a marked change in the way India approached the standoff this time around. Also up for conversation in all probability will be the border demarcation of that extremely long, 4,000-kilometer long border that India and China share in terms of the line of actual control. But these visuals right now of that bilateral taking place between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and representatives of India and their counterparts from China, including the President Xi Jinping.
国际社会共同期待，中方也能一方一道，以共同倡导的和平共处。
Now, just to remind our viewers, there's nothing out of the ordinary in terms of this bilateral. It is a necessary engagement that takes place between the leaders of all BRICS nations. There's no doubt about that. But for now, of course, the focus on India and China relations following the Doklam standoff, following the inclusion of Pakistan-based terror groups in the Xiamen declaration of yesterday, just goes to show how important this meeting has become in light of recent developments.
China is prepared to work with India to seek guidance from President Xi on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a joint initiative between our two countries to enhance our political mutual trust, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, and in this way ensure that our bilateral relationship will make further advancement along the right course.
ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन की सफलता के लिए मैं आपको, आपकी पूरी टीम को हृदय से बहुत बहुत बधाई देना चाहता हूं। मैं समझता हूं कि तेज गति से बदलते वैश्विक परिवेश में ब्रिक्स को और अधिक प्रासंगिक बनाने में यह शिखर सम्मेलन सचमुच में बहुत सफल हुआ है।
阁下，我们的这个团这次受到了热情的接待和周到的安排，我对此先向您表示感谢。我很高兴再次有机会跟您会见。这次的行政峰会圆满成功，对此我向您和您的代表团表示祝贺。现在的世界有迅速的变化，在这个背景下，金砖国家要加强合作，在这一方面，这次的峰会发挥了非常重要的作用。
मुझे याद है कि गोवा के ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन को खुशियां और सफलता के लिए चीन से और व्यक्तिगत तौर पर मुझे आपसे
All right, we'll try and get back to those visuals in just a second, but Prime Minister Narendra Modi just beginning his comments at that bilateral that's being held between India and China. Prime Minister Modi, of course, there alongside President Xi Jinping. Lots is being made and lots is being talked about that bilateral between those two leaders. Of course, given what's happened on the Doklam standoff that captured Asia and the world at large's attention for a good 73 days. It was diplomatically resolved, with both countries choosing to back off, diplomatically coming to a resolution of sorts on Doklam. So that obviously perhaps might coming up for conversation today at the meeting that's underway right now. Also, of course, that border demarcation, that 4,000 kilometer long border demarcation might come up for conversation. Ramesh Ramachandran, my colleague, joining us live from Xiamen. Also with me is WION senior editor Surya Gangadharan. Thanks both for being here. Ramesh, if I can come to you first. You know, we've just seen the meeting get underway. The points of conversation from the media's point of view seem to be pretty clear, but at the end of the day, it all might end up changing entirely, especially given that yesterday Prime Minister Modi, for instance, didn't even mention terror in his comments, or mention Pakistan, pardon me, in his comments on at the plenary session. So whatever we might be talking about, it might come out to be a completely different point of conversation at that meeting.
Absolutely, Aisha. I don't want to second guess what Prime Minister Modi will indeed raise with President Xi, and nor would the Indian diplomats accompanying Prime Minister Modi are telling WION that when the two principals meet, as they are at the moment, they can be expected to raise all bilateral, regional and global issues of mutual concern to both India and China. But just as an aside, again, Aisha, unlike Prime Minister Modi's meetings with other world leaders, especially President Trump, who he met in the month of June, one didn't see the popular bear hug in the case of these two leaders. So clearly there might be a subliminal messaging there, and Surya might want to weigh in on that. But that said, the primary concern from both sides would be to maintain the relations on an even keel going forward. They do not want surprises to impede their growth. Both are growing economies, and BRICS being a regional grouping which wants to shift the balance of power from the developed economies to the developing economies. It is incumbent upon both India and China to come to a modus vivendi on the way forward on tackling issues of global concern, be it trade and investment, climate change, sustainable development, and to reduce their political divergences, therefore assumes all the more significance.
Absolutely. Surya, would you like to weigh in on that bear hug and the absence thereof this time around when it came to President Xi and Prime Minister Modi?
Well, I wonder if President Xi hugs his iron brother Pakistan. Having said that, I think one doesn't get the impression that the Chinese are into this bear hugging thing, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
They tend to keep a little distance, and you know, I get back to that long walk that each of the BRICS leaders had to make in Xiamen over the red carpet to meet President Xi. You know, a bit like the Middle Kingdom kind of syndrome, you know. I think we'll have to see what emanates, what the two sides come out of this meeting and tell the press.
Right.
But frankly, meetings of this kind are really a broad brush review of bilateral, regional and international issues. And I don't think either leader would have gone to the nitty-gritty of Doklam or anything else. Frankly, I don't believe there is a version that the Chinese would have perhaps provoked India on Doklam with that kind of road building activity. I don't believe that's the case. It may have just been a local level contractor building a road, and that snowballed into face-off between the two countries.
Absolutely.
So, in my view, they will look at a broad range of issues, way to take the relationship forward, what are the disputes, maybe a look at the border dispute and how to resolve it.
Surya, if you'll allow me to come in, please. We've re-established that connection with the bilateral meeting. Let's get the audio up and see if we can listen in to what's being said right now between the two countries.
一个健康稳定的中印关系符合两国人民根本利益，也是本地区和国际社会的共同期待。中方愿同印方一道，以共同 倡导的和平共处原则为指导，增进政治互信，推进区域合作，推动中印关系正确轨道发展。
China and India are each other's major neighbors. We are also at the same time two of the world's largest developing and emerging countries. A healthy and stable China-India relationship serves the fundamental interests of the people of both countries. It is also the shared expectation of our region and the international community. China is prepared to work with India to seek guidance from Panchashila, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a joint initiative between our two countries to enhance our political mutual trust, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, and in this way ensure that our bilateral relationship will make further advancement along the right course.
ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन की सफलता के लिए मैं आपको, आपकी पूरी टीम को हृदय से बहुत बहुत बधाई देना चाहता हूं। मैं समझता हूं कि तेज गति से बदलते वैश्विक परिवेश में ब्रिक्स को और अधिक प्रासंगिक बनाने में यह शिखर सम्मेलन सचमुच में बहुत सफल हुआ है।
我们的这次受到了热情的接待和周到的安排，我对此向嘉宾表示感谢。我很高兴再次有机会跟您会见。这次的行政峰会圆满成功，对此我向您和您的代表团表示祝贺。现在的世界有迅速的变化，在这个背景下，金砖国家要加强合作，在这一方面，这次的访会发挥了非常重要的作用。
मुझे याद है कि गोवा के ब्रिक्स शिखर सम्मेलन की खुशियां और सफलता के लिए चीन से
All right, we'll get back to the meeting and talk more about what might end up coming up for discussion in a bit. Let me go back to my colleague Surya Gangadharan. Surya, we can't take away from the fact that the mention of terror, for instance, it keeps coming up in that Xiamen declaration. A lot of people put it down to the changing relationship between India and China following Doklam. But is it also important to remember that this might just be a temporary resolution of sorts, that the situation is in flux, not just in Asia, but globally speaking as well. And what might be true today might end up being very different tomorrow and day after.
I don't believe the Chinese-Pakistani relationship is transforming into something dramatically different from what they've been doing for so long. What happened at Xiamen in the declaration was something which has happened earlier also, including at the heart of Asia. And if you read the lines carefully, many of the groups mentioned there are groups that are have some problems with some of the members of BRICS. And in that sense, everybody's concerns were taken into account. And as Ambassador Singh and I were discussing earlier, there was China as the host was also anxious to end up with a successful summit, successful declaration, one which reflected the views of all the members present. So in that sense, there was a feel-good feeling and a feel-good factor to this also. But it would be wrong to interpret this as bringing about any change in the relationship with Pakistan. That country remains China's iron brother, and it's business as usual with them.
Absolutely. But Ramesh, let me probe that a bit further with you. It's obviously going to be an embarrassment for Pakistan, considering that its iron brother, its strongest ally, China, has chosen or agreed to allowing the mention of Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed to make its way into that declaration as the host country. That didn't even happen when India was hosting BRICS last year.
Indeed, Aisha, if I were Pakistan, I'd be very disappointed on two counts. One, here is my all-weather friend China agreeing to India's proposal for including terrorist groups operating on Pakistani soil by name in the Xiamen Declaration. that is would have come as a big disappointment for Pakistan, number one. Number two, just weeks ago we saw the Trump administration devise or unveil its South Asia strategy, focusing only on Afghanistan, which gives India a more influential role in stabilizing Afghanistan, which again would not have been to Pakistan's liking, and Pakistan has made its displeasure known. So on both counts, on Afghanistan and on China, US and China, Aisha, Pakistan would be disappointed by their disposition towards Islamabad. But that said, as I said before, if the Doklam standoff could have been a ploy, a tactic to drive a wedge between India and Bhutan, the Xiamen declaration could also be seen in the context of driving a wedge with Chinese complicity, by the way, between China's all-weather relationship with Pakistan. So Pakistan would be disappointed on both counts vis-a-vis the US and China, presumably.